Gettysburg is one of the most talked about and written about battlefields, but there is still a lot to be found and a lot to be discovered. And Mark is going to share one of those hidden treasures, the Lost Avenue. As you know, the presentation is pre-recorded, but Mark will be available for questions after the presentation. When you go to do the questions, just raise your hand. You don't have to do it the Zoom way. You can just raise your hand the regular way as if you were in the same room. Now, most everybody knows Mark, but he gave me this really great biography, and I wouldn't want it to go to waste. So I'm going to give you a bit of that presentation. Mark is a trustee on the board of the Albany Cemetery Association and the editor of the Friends of Albany Rural Cemetery newsletter. He is currently the vice president of the Historical Society of the Town of Colony after serving as president from 2012 to 2016. He's also the editor of the Colony Historical Society newsletter. He's a grad at Central High School in Hudson Valley from Watervliet Arsenal, and now he says life is good, every day is Saturday. Mark's primary hobby is documenting Civil War soldiers and sailors interred at Albany Rural Cemetery. He's been working on it for 25 years, and he's documented nearly 1,100 men from the Civil War and uncovered stories of both men and women of the Civil War period. Many of these stories have been published in the Friends of Albany Rural Cemetery newsletter.
So everybody join.
Yeah, he's given lots of historical presentations to countless organizations all the way from Hadley, Luzerne in the north to Gettysburg in the south. He's led many Civil War walking tours at Albany Rural Cemetery and has also served as Master of Ceremonies for several gravestone dedication ceremonies. He was the primary researcher for the book People of Albany, the Civil War, and was a contributor to the more recent book, These Exalted Acres, Unlocking the Secrets of Albany Rural Cemetery. He's also been published in Military Images magazine, but far more important, he is in 2004, Mark and four friends founded the Civil War Buffs History Group, which we know more commonly as the Buffs. Now, Mark and his wife of 45 years, Carol, have two grown daughters and three lovely grandchildren. So now that you know a bit more about Mark, Mark will tell you a bit more about the Lost Avenue at Gettysburg.
Patrick's going to go to
Can everyone hear me? Okay. Just give me a thumbs up if you can hear me.
Of course, you're 4 feet away from me. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much for such a nice introduction, Stuart, and I thank you all for joining in on this presentation. I want to mention up front that over the years this club has existed, we've had several changes of locations for our meetings. Those of you who have been members of the Buffs from the beginning will recall that we started at the Butcher Block on Central Avenue. We then moved to the Dakota Steakhouse in Latham Farms. We then had 4 meetings at the Barnsider on Sand Creek Road before moving to Buca de Beppo on Wolf Road. And now we are at Swifties on Everett Road. My point is that our club is resilient, and our board is always looking for good presentations and convenient meeting places for our group to gather. But now in 2020, due to conditions imposed during the COVID-19 pandemic, we've been forced to cancel our first 2 meetings of this year. This Zoom meeting was necessitated to send a notice to our membership that we are still a resilient club. This Zoom meeting is a first for our club. Mind you, it's all.
I'll let him know.
Also a first for me. In that regard, I ask that if I fumble the ball a few times during this slideshow, that my audience will be forgiving. Now, most of you have known me for many, many years. Some of us formed relationships going back to 1992 when I joined the Capital District Civil War Roundtable. Many others met me after we started the Civil War Buffs. By the way, the Civil War Buffs is our official name, but we've been known as the Buffs since our first meeting in January of 2004. Also, most, if not all of you, realize that my interest in Civil War history is centered around what local people did in support of the war effort. Not just the soldiers and sailors, but the physicians and clergy that traveled to the front lines with the regiments, the industrialists who manufactured the implements of war, the politicians who progressed the war effort, and the women of the period, the nurses that traveled to the field hospitals or ran the sanitary fairs and the Albany Relief Bazaar in support of the Sanitary Commission, and the families, the mothers and fathers, sisters and brothers, and the housewives and children of the absent soldier, all of whom sacrificed so much during the conflict. Lastly, I'm sure that you all realize that my primary focus is on people who were buried in Albany Rural Cemetery. As expected, the majority of Civil War soldiers buried in Albany Rural Cemetery served in the Army of the Potomac and fought in many of the battles against Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia. The most written about battle, of course, is the Battle of Gettysburg during the first 3 days of July 1863. Now, before we get started on the 43rd New York and the Lost Avenue at Gettysburg, I want to introduce a short sidebar topic that I think would be interesting to the Buffs. In 2011, the 150th anniversary of the start of the Civil War, a ceremony was held at the gravesite of Colonel Elmer Ellsworth at the Hudson View Cemetery in Mechanicsville. We all know that Ellsworth was the first Union officer killed during the Civil War. And in this photo, you see the opening procession of reenactors through the cemetery. Now, at this time, I'd like to introduce my laser pointer in the upper left-hand corner of the screen. Several members of the Buffs are proudly represented, and they're leading the procession in the color guard. We'll go from left to right. Suave reenactor and longtime member of the Buffs, Skip Griffiths. This gentleman here is our Vice President, Jim Sweeney. Carrying the American flag is longtime reenactor and longtime member of the Buffs, Bob Shuey. Next to the Irish Brigade flag, we have yours truly. And on my left is WAB reenactor and longtime member of the Buffs, Mark Russell. Also, the gentleman here with the white glove is another longtime reenactor and longtime member of the Buffs, Howie Young. Now, Albany was a fairly large city in the 1850s and 1860s. And of course, it was also the capital of New York State. As a result, many regiments were recruited from and trained in Albany. A few of these regiments are shown on the screen. First, we look at the 7th New York Heavy Artillery Regiment. They originally started as the 113th New York Infantry, but the regiment was converted to a heavy artillery regiment just 4 months after it was mustered in. The book, A Carnival of Blood, by local author Bob Keating, is a fantastic research source to learn the details of this regiment. Next one down is the 177th New York. It was a 9-month regiment, and it served in Sherman's division of the Department of the Gulf. Their major engagement was at the Siege of Port Hudson, Louisiana, one of the few regiments from around here that didn't serve in the Army of the Potomac. Next, we see the 44th New York. It was organized and trained in Albany. They were known as Ellsworth's Avengers, and the 44th New York was listed among Fox's 300 fighting regiments. Now we come to the 43rd New York. 4 full companies of the 43rd Infantry were recruited from Albany. They were known as the Albany Rifles, and the 43rd is listed among Fox's 300 fighting regiments. I'd like to note here, because we're going to be talking about Gettysburg, that 54 men from the 43rd are interred in Albany Rural Cemetery. 34 of those men served at Gettysburg. This flank marker of the 43rd was presented to the regiment by a local militia unit, the Albany Burgesses Corps. The flag features an appliqued white Greek cross, the symbol of the 2nd Division, 6th Army Corps. And you can make out a red 43 in the center of that white cross for the 43rd New York Infantry. I've been to Gettysburg countless times over the past 28 years. I've read Edwin Coddington's book, The Gettysburg Campaign, 3 or 4 times, maybe 5 times. I mean, what Gettysburg buff hasn't, right? I keep Coddington's book in my reference library here at home, and I refer to it often. Coddington's book may still be considered the Bible of the Battle of Gettysburg. When I would then visit the Holy Land, aka Gettysburg, back in the, say, 1990s, I would first read a segment of Coddington's book beforehand. Maybe it was the fighting around the Brickyard, or perhaps Oak Hill and Forney's Field, or even Spangler's Spring. And then I would make it a point to recall what Coddington had written when I'd visit that particular site. That's how I learned about the Battle of Gettysburg. Now, during my trips to Gettysburg, I've also tried to locate the monuments to local regiments that served there. We just mentioned the 44th New York, that's one on Little Round Top, and the 125th New York as well. But the monument to the 43rd New York always escaped my grasp. So a couple of years ago, in 2017, my wife Carol and I were at the Gettysburg National Military Park Visitor Center. And while there, I inquired of one of the park rangers at the desk where I might be able to find a monument for the 43rd New York Infantry Regiment. The park ranger pretty much said, you can't get there from here. Well, he chuckled, and then he told me that the easiest way to get to the monument is to cross private property. The kindly park ranger gave me the name and phone number of the owner of the property so that I could ask permission. Well, when we got back to my hotel room, I called the number, but the owner didn't answer his phone, so I left a message. And by the time he returned my call, Carol and I were well on our way home. But the gentleman left me an open invitation to contact him the next time I'd be in town. And 2 years later, in March of 2019, Carol and I were back in Gettysburg. and I called the property owner and made the necessary arrangements to cross his property. First, for those of you who haven't been to the Holy Land, that is Gettysburg, north is up here at the top of the map. Here you can see the city of Gettysburg and all the internal streets and roads. And you can also tell that Gettysburg is truly a hub city. And it's shown by these spokes, I call them spokes, of roads that travel into and out of the city. On this side here, we have the Chambersburg Pike. And on the east side, this is the York Pike. Coming back down here, you have the Fairfield Road, Emmitsburg Road, Taneytown Road, and the Baltimore Pike. Also, a few of the well-known sites on the battlefield are listed. You see Oak Ridge here at the top, Seminary Ridge, Cemetery Ridge, Culp's Hill, East Cavalry Field, and Little Round Top. Now, I've enlarged this map a little bit for the next slide so you can get a closer view. Heading southward out of the city of Gettysburg, if you bear this way, going toward the lower right-hand corner of the map, you see the Baltimore Pike. Bring your attention to the area above and south of Culp's Hill. You see this blue line. That blue line is Rock Creek. And right here, you can see that's where Rock Creek flows underneath the Baltimore Pike. I put this red star on the map. This is the area of the property that we are interested in. The Baltimore Pike crosses Rock Creek at this point. You can faintly see it on the other side of the metal road barrier here, just above my laser pointer. You'll also notice these white structures in the background. This is the property of the private property that we'll need access to in order to find the Lost Avenue at Gettysburg. In this slide, we're looking northward on the Baltimore Pike. I mean, literally, I'm standing in the middle of the road on the Baltimore Pike. Thank God it was a Sunday morning when I took these pictures and there was no traffic. But you can see below the laser pointer, the sign that says Rock Creek. And you actually can get a little glimpse of Rock Creek through this metal road barrier. Now, let me move the pointer here. Below the pointer, you can see the reflection of the trees off Rock Creek. In the next slide, we're going to look right or over this way from the same position. Now, here are those white buildings, the structures that I talked about in the last slide. During the battle, this was known as the Baker Farm. In addition to the living quarters here in the center, above my pointer of the picture, there's an outbuilding over here above my pointer on the left. There's a fairly large barn above the pointer here. And below the pointer, you can faintly make out a chicken coop. Now, the current owners I mentioned down here are Dean and Judy Schultz. I'll introduce you to Dean Schultz in an upcoming slide. Here we see a Google Maps bird's eye view of the property in question. Starting over here in the upper left corner, we see the Baltimore Pike coming down. And right here, you can see it says Rock Creek, and it flows right down this way and underneath Baltimore Pike. And right here, we're standing in front of those, the property, the white structures. And I wanted to point out that this tree line right here, that is the Lost Avenue at Gettysburg. And I chose this slide to present to you today because the distance from the Lost Avenue to to the Baltimore Pike, according to Google Maps measuring stick, is 1,062 feet roughly. Well, that's a little bit more than 3 football fields if you include the end zones. It's fairly steep. The slope is fairly steep from the house to the Lost Avenue. Now, when Mr. Schultz and I got past the chicken coop, we could make out this large open field that you see here. This tree line is the Lost Avenue of Gettysburg. And we could make out a couple of the monuments. Here's one. Above the pointer is one, and one other one right here. This is the Lost Avenue of Gettysburg. It's located on a prominence known as Wolf's Hill. We began by arriving at the monument here on the left. But first, before seeing the regimental monuments on Wolf's Hill, what is the official name of the Lost Avenue? It's Neal Avenue, named for Brigadier General Thomas H. Neal, the brigade commander of the regiments that were deployed here on July the 2nd and 3rd of 1863. It's important to note that Neal's brigade was part of the 6th Corps, which was under the command of Major General John Sedgwick. The 6th Corps had marched about 35 miles in the course of 17 hours to arrive on the battlefield at Gettysburg, on what would be the longest of their forced marches during the 4-year span of the Civil War. Neal's brigade was ordered to protect the Army's major supply line on the Baltimore Pike. We're going to begin our tour of the monuments on the Lost Avenue at the north end of Neal Avenue. This is the first monument that we see on the Lost Avenue, the 49th New York Infantry. They were known as the 2nd Buffalo Regiment. I didn't get a good photo of the 49th monument, so I downloaded this from the internet, and hence this date at the bottom. That was not the date that we were in Gettysburg. We were there in 2019 to get our pictures. Next in line, heading southward, is the 7th Maine Regimental Monument. 6 companies of the 7th Maine were present during the battle. Next, we see the monument I had been looking for, the 43rd New York Infantry, also known as the Albany Rifles. I'll tell you more about them in a minute. Now, I know what some of you are thinking. What the heck is George Clooney doing at the monument for the 43rd New York at the Lost Avenue of Gettysburg? Well, truth be told, that's not George. A close look-alike, though, that's me, standing next to the 43rd monument. I had to have Mr. Schultz take a picture of me to prove that I was actually there. And this, ladies and gentlemen, is Dean Schultz, the current owner of the land that leads to the Lost Avenue. Now, Mr. Schultz was very kind and accommodating in my quest to find the 43rd monument. He really didn't want his picture taken, but he relented fairly easily when I told him I wanted to get him into one of the pictures. I mentioned earlier in the presentation that getting from Mr. Schultz's house to the Lost Avenue was a steep slope all the way. You'll notice that Mr. Schultz has a cane, maybe a walking stick. Well, I have to tell you, I don't think that Mr. Schultz ever used it as a walking aid, but more as a pointer along the way. And when we reached the Lost Avenue, I admit I was winded and I had to take a minute to catch my breath. Mr. Schultz wasn't winded at all. He used the time that I was trying to catch my breath to provide the narrative of what happened on the Lost Avenue for each of the regiments. I have to say, for a man of his age, his energy was incredible. The last of the 4 regiments deployed here on the Lost Avenue is the 61st Pennsylvania Infantry. Now, this was actually the first monument erected on the Lost Avenue. It was dedicated in 1888 during the 25th anniversary of the battle. That is Mr. Schultz that you see on the left. Behind the monument and to the left of the monument, above my laser pointer, is a sign. That sign is this one. And you can see that it says it's the extreme right flank of the infantry of General Meade's Army of the Potomac. And that statement is also forever engraved on the monument itself, right here. It's commonly thought that some regiment on Culp's Hill held the right flank of the infantry. But now we know it was the 61st Pennsylvania on Wolf's Hill. This is the Union Brigade marker on the Lost Avenue. Similar brigade markers are located in a variety of spots all around the battlefield at Gettysburg and other Civil War battlefields as well. The writing on these markers describes the positions and actions of the Union Brigade that was deployed in that area. Now, a brigade, of course, typically consisted of 4 or 5 regiments. Neal's brigade, that is the 3rd Brigade, 2nd Division of the 6th Corps, consisted of 5 regiments, but only 4 of those regiments were actually deployed on the Lost Avenue. One regiment of Neal's brigade, the 77th New York, was ordered to stay behind at their original position on Powers Hill to guard General Slocum's headquarters and to support the batteries there. Now we talk about the 77th New York Regiment. It's important to note at this time that the 77th New York Regiment was from Saratoga and was known as the Bemis Heights Regiment. Just 2 weeks ago, this monument to the 77th in Congress Park in Saratoga, the statue on top was torn down and destroyed by vandals. Such a cowardly, shameful, and uneducated act toward men who fought to end slavery and unify the country. I just can't get over this kind of disrespect. This photo was taken looking south down the Lost Avenue. Mr. Schultz informed me that the stone wall here on the left was there during the battle, while the stone wall on the opposite side was constructed sometime after the battle. Once again, here is that original stone wall that we saw on the previous slide. Of course, being an authentic artifact of the Battle of Gettysburg, I just had to go and touch it. But that's what we Civil War enthusiasts do, when not permitted, of course.
You can put a stone in your
43rd
pocket,
New York Infantry suffered a total of 5 casualties at Gettysburg during their time on Wolf's Hill. All men were from Company A. Now, Joseph Cottrell was a 29-year-old man from Albany, where he enlisted. He was wounded in the right arm on July the 3rd, 1863. His arm was amputated, and he was sent to Camp Letterman, where he died on August the 13th, 1863. Cottrell was originally buried in the Letterman Cemetery, but he was reinterred in the Gettysburg National Cemetery in the New York plot, grave E52, if anyone is interested. Private Albert Post was 21 years old when he enlisted at Cooperstown. Post was shot in the chest and killed on July 3rd, 1863. He too was buried in the Gettysburg National Cemetery, New York plot, grave E98. Captain William Gilfillan was a 19-year-old young man who enlisted at New York City. He was wounded in the abdomen and he died July the 3rd, 1863. And he's buried in No, not Albany Rural Cemetery. He's buried in Greenwood Cemetery in Brooklyn. Now, in comparison to the other regiments that were deployed on the Lost Avenue, the 43rd didn't really make out too poorly. The 49th New York suffered 2 men wounded, and both recovered from their wounds. The 7th Maine Regiment had a total of 7 casualties. 5 were wounded, 2 mortally wounded. And the 61st Pennsylvania only suffered 1 wounded and 1 missing. So what do we know about General Thomas Neal? Well, Neal was born in Philadelphia in 1826. Graduated from West Point in the class of 1847. He ranked 27th in his class of 38. Other West Point graduates of the class included A.P. Hill, who graduated 15th, Ambrose Burnside, graduated 18th, John Gibbon, graduated 20th, Roman Ayers, 22nd, and also Major General Henry Heath. Henry Heath was the only officer in the Army of Northern Virginia whom Robert E. Lee addressed by his given name. Heath was the GOAT of the class. He graduated 38 out of 38. Now, a classmate of Neal's at West Point with a local connection was this man, Egbert Vielli. Vielli graduated 30th in the class, but I mentioned a local connection. He was born in Waterford. He was educated in Lansingburg and at Albany Academy. After the Civil War, he was the chief engineer for the construction of Central Park in New York City. He served as a congressman from 1885 to 1887. And Egbert Vielli died in New York City in 1902. At this point, I think it's appropriate to mention that Vielli is buried in, no, not Albany Rural Cemetery. He's buried in the U.S. Military Academy Post Cemetery at West Point. Now, why? Well, one of Vielli's engineering projects involved the enlargement of the cemetery at West Point. Vielli obtained permission to build a tomb at West Point for himself and his wife. So today, this pyramid-shaped tomb is a landmark at West Point. Has a footprint of 25 feet by 31 feet, so it's not a small monument. Now back to General Neal. Although he graduated from West Point in 1847, he did not serve in Mexico during the Mexican War. Rather, he was on frontier duty with the 5th U.S. Infantry. He came back from that and served 3 years as an instructor at West Point. And then at the outbreak of the Civil War in February 1862, Neal was commissioned colonel of the 23rd Pennsylvania Infantry. Very fitting, as he was from Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. He was promoted to brigade command after the Battle of Antietam, the 3rd Brigade, the 2nd Division, the 6th Corps. Neal served as the brigade commander at many battles during the war, but after the Wilderness, he was appointed to command the 2nd Division. Now, after the Civil War, he was breveted a major general in the regular army. He went on to serve as the commandant of cadets at West Point for 4 years, after which he was transferred to the 8th U.S. Cavalry, from which he retired in 1883. Neal died in Philadelphia in 1885. He was only 59 years old. And he's buried in West Point. Where else? And now we come to the beginning of the end of the slideshow. This will be the fun part of my presentation, at least fun for me. Now, there's no mention in Coddington's book of the action on Wolf's Hill. The best account of the fighting there can be found in this book, Harry Fontz's book, Gettysburg, Culp's Hill, and Cemetery Hill. Now, Fontz writes that at Gettysburg, Neal's brigade wasn't involved in a pitched battle. They were never assaulted, nor did they mount an assault, but rather the brigade was engaged in skirmishing. The list of casualties for each regiment on Wolf's Hill that we went through a few minutes ago was actually quite low. We know today that they were only dealing with a portion of the 2nd Virginia Infantry and some of the 1st North Carolina Infantry. Yet, years after the war, some of Neal's Gettysburg veterans took satisfaction in the belief that they prevented the rebels from turning the Federal right flank. Well, truth be told, the opposing Confederate troops weren't trying to turn their flank, but rather they were simply screening the left flank of Confederate Major General Richard Ewell's 2nd Corps. And so, although Neal's brigade succeeded in doing what it was supposed to do at Gettysburg, to hold the line as ordered by General Meade, Fonce insists that under Neal's command, the brigade could have done much more. One example he gives of that was the 27th Indiana Infantry, which was deployed north of Neal's brigade across Rock Creek. The 27th Indiana were being harassed in McAllister's Woods by Confederate fire from east of Rock Creek. Now, the rebel skirmishers were on the same side of the creek as Neal's brigade. And the men from the 27th Indiana were wondering why the Virginians weren't being driven from their front. I mean, after all, Neal's brigade had 1,400 officers and men and should have easily been able to push the Confederate skirmishers from their position. But Neal never took that initiative. He never requested permission to do anything more than he was told to do: hold the line. At this time, I want to mention some interesting tidbits about the Albany regiments that I mentioned earlier in the slideshow. This is Colonel Lewis Owen Morris of the 7th New York Heavy Artillery Regiment. Colonel Morris was born in Albany, and he was killed by a Confederate sharpshooter at Cold Harbor on June the 4th, 1864. His father was Brevet Major Lewis Nelson Morris, who was killed in the attack on Monterey during the Mexican War. His grandfather, Captain Stats Morris, served under General Mad Anthony Wayne during the Revolutionary War. And his great-grandfather, Lewis Morris, was a signer of the Declaration of Independence. What a lineage. And to no one's surprise, Colonel Lewis Owen Morris is buried in Albany Rural Cemetery. This is James Clay Rice of the 44th New York Infantry. Rice originally served as a captain in the 39th New York, the Garibaldi Guard. And while there, he quelled a formidable mutiny within the ranks. And for his work in doing this, he was sent to Albany and promoted to lieutenant colonel to recruit and organize the 44th New York. At Gettysburg, Rice was the commanding officer of the 44th New York. When his brigade commander, Colonel Strong Vincent, was mortally wounded on Little Round Top, command of the brigade devolved upon the senior regimental commander in the brigade. That happened to be James Clay Rice. Now, we've all seen the movie Gettysburg. What you may not realize is that an actor actually portrayed General Rice, or I'm sorry, at the time he was Colonel Rice in the movie. It was after Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain was wounded and was limping back up the slope of Little Round Top. He was approached by an officer who congratulated Chamberlain on his bayonet attack on the assaulting Confederates. That actor was portraying Colonel Rice, who was promoted to Brigadier General the month after Gettysburg. Now, General Rice was mortally wounded at Spotsylvania on May the 10th, 1864. Before I forget to mention it, Rice is buried in Albany Rural Cemetery. His last words before dying are engraved here on his obelisk. Turn me over and let me die with my face to the foe. This is Colonel Ira Ainsworth of the 177th New York. Ainsworth was born in Vermont. When he came to this area, he got interested in the National Guard, and he became the colonel of the 10th New York State National Guard, which formed the basis for the 177th New York Infantry. Ainsworth was appointed colonel of the 177th, and he led the regiment during the siege of Port Hudson, Louisiana, where many of the men of the regiment came down with typhoid fever, and a number of them died from disease. I just wanted to say at this point that Ira Ainsworth is buried in Albany Rural Cemetery. Here we see Benjamin Franklin Baker, served in the 43rd New York from captain on up to colonel, but he commanded the 43rd only up until Gettysburg when he took a leave of absence. He was given a promotion to Brevet Brigadier General in March of 1865 for faithful and meritorious service during the war. And Baker died in Burnt Hills in 1907. Might be good to mention that General Baker happens to be buried in Albany Rural Cemetery. With Colonel Baker's leave of absence, during the Battle of Gettysburg, the 43rd New York was commanded by their Lieutenant Colonel, John Wilson. Now, Wilson was born in Albany. He graduated from Albany Academy, and he was promoted to full bird colonel on March the 15th, 1864. Unfortunately, Wilson was killed 10 months after Gettysburg at the Battle of the Wilderness in May of 1864, just 2 months after his promotion to full bird colonel. He was an only child, and in his death, he left a widowed mother. I should probably state that Colonel Wilson is buried in Albany Rural Cemetery. And so, you have now learned where the lost Avenue of Gettysburg is located, on Wolf's Hill, south of Culp's Hill. As Paul Harvey would say, and now you know the rest of the story. Reflects the reference materials I used to develop this presentation. The first one that you see on the list is The Heroes of Albany by Rufus W. Clarke. Heroes of Albany contains biographies of men from the city and county of Albany. It contains over 150 of the longer biographies and another 150 plus shorter biographies. Each man represented in the book died during the Civil War, either from wounds or disease. Many of them are buried in Albany Rural Cemetery. And in fact, even the author of Heroes of Albany, Reverend Dr. Rufus Wheelwright Clarke, is buried in Albany Rural Cemetery. Next up is the Gettysburg Campaign by Edwin Cottington. In its day, this book would be considered the Bible of the Battle of Gettysburg, and perhaps it still is today. Harry Fotz's book, Gettysburg, Culp's Hill, and Cemetery Hill. This is actually the sequel to Fotz's first book, entitled Gettysburg, the Second Day. This sequel provides the best account I've found on the fighting on Wolf's Hill. These Honored Dead by John Busey. Busey's book lists all the Union casualties at Gettysburg, first by state and then the regiments within that state. It contains many, many details that Busey discovered during his research in the medical files at the National Archives. Generals in Blue by Ezra Warner. This book is a compilation of brief biographies of all men who were promoted to general in the Union Army. Warner has a second book, Generals in Gray, which does the same for Confederate generals. And if you have both of these books in your reference library, you definitely want to pick up this one as well. This is a great work by authors Roger Hunt and Jack Brown, for it does what Generals in Blue does not do. It lists all the Union officers who were breveted to general, most commonly for meritorious services during the war. It includes their regiment, date of birth, date of death, civilian occupation, and where they're buried. Photos of the men are also included in the book. By the way, 11 men in this book are buried in Albany Rural Cemetery. New York at Gettysburg. This is a 3-volume set that records the involvement of every New York regiment that was present at the Battle of Gettysburg. The 43rd New York is written about in Volume 1. I note here that in the 43rd New York write-up, the historical remarks of the regiment were provided by Major John L. Newman. Now, Major Newman was from Albany. He was a cousin of my very first Civil War research project, Lieutenant William Henry Pullman of the 59th New York. Pullman, of course, also resided in Albany. The cousins both served at Gettysburg in their respective regiments. But Pullman was mortally wounded there during Pickett's charge. And by the way, both men are buried within yards of each other in Albany Rural Cemetery. Well, this concludes the slideshow of the 43rd New York and the Lost Avenue at Gettysburg. And now the mystery has been solved. We've located the Lost Avenue at Gettysburg. We also know that we shouldn't try to find the Lost Avenue without permission from the landowner, Dean Schultz. And we have also discovered the prominence of the Civil War soldiers who were buried in Albany Rural Cemetery. I thank you all very much for your patience and indulgence, and I hope the slideshow was both informative and enjoyable. But most important is that you learned something new during the presentation. Now, questions and answers will follow, so please stay tuned while Patrick O'Connor and I figure out how to go live. Thank you all very much. I truly appreciate your time.
Go ahead and unmute yourself.
Can everybody hear me? Everybody can hear me? Okay, good, thank you. Okay, well, I hope you like this presentation on Albany Rural, on the Lost Avenue at Gettysburg. We were cracking up here. I don't even know if you guys could see me, but I was cracking up through the whole thing. Hey, you got to have a good time when you do this stuff. But also, I hope I got out a lot of the facts of what occurred down there and where the Lost Avenue is. At this time, I'll take any questions. So just raise your hand if you have a question. Lou? I what? Unmute, Lou.
Mark, where do you plan on being buried?
You got him turned up? He's unmuted. You gotta turn it on.
I'm sorry, I missed all that.
I'm sorry?
Can you repeat that? I missed all that.
Where do you plan on being buried?
I'm going to be interred in
Albany
Rural Cemetery.
Not for a long time, hopefully.
Well, you know, I started researching there around 1990, 92. I don't really remember when. And, you know, over the years, that's almost 30 years ago. And I keep trying to find a different hobby. But it's like The Godfather Part 3, where Al Pacino says, every time I think I'm out, they pull me back in. So I said, I might as well be buried there.
It was an awesome presentation, Mark. Thank you very much.
Ah, thanks, Lou. Appreciate that. Anybody else have a question?
Did you get Steve Muller's question?
No.
Should be on the thing. He said, when was the monument to the 43rd erected?
When was the monument to the 43rd New York erected? It just so happened
1888.
off the top of my head, but I do have this book, which will tell me. Dedicated in 1889, so a year after the 61st Pennsylvania. Anything else, Steve? Okay. From Diane, is the Lost Avenue part of the national park? If not, are there efforts to preserve it? The Lost Avenue is part of the national park, and you can get there from another area where you don't have to cross the private property. Private property really is just the easiest way of getting there, even though I was pretty winded getting up the hill. But you have to go all the way south down to just about, what do they call it? Highway 15, south of the town on the Baltimore Pike. Once you get in there, there's a place to park your car. It's not paved, you have to park it off the dirt road. But then you have to hike, and they don't maintain the hiking trail. So it's quite a walk. Yeah, a lot of that is uphill. There are trees that have fallen and cross the path. You either have to climb over them or go around them. So it's cumbersome to get there that way. But the National Park Service does come in. I'm not sure how they get in there, but they take care of mowing the Lost Avenue and taking care of any of the stones that might be taken down. I don't know if you noticed one of the slides, but it was the picture where I said that I had to go and touch the wall. In the background, just on the other side of that wall, there was a Confederate flag.
Confederate flag.
Confederates were. You saw that, Mark?
Yep.
Yeah. Anything else, Diana?
No, that was a great presentation and your photos were beautiful.
Oh, thanks. Appreciate that.
Mark, do you think those are the same stones in the wall that were there? Or has that been replenished and maintained?
I don't know about replenished. I was just told, I mean, it happened how many years ago? 170 years ago. So I don't know how many would be original. I know that they look two different colors. The old ones are very gray and the newer ones are darker.
Yeah.
But was there a question at the bottom of the screen?
Mhm.
What was it? It goes away on my,
Oh, it does?
yeah.
Was the Lost Avenue considered a major battle?
No, Lost Avenue was not a major battle. It was skirmishing. That's all that really happened there.
That was from me.
Oh, that was from Patrick. Okay. I'm sorry. Patrick had asked if it was a major battle. No, it wasn't part of any of the major battles. It was nothing like Little Round Top or even Forney's Field, things like that. It was skirmishing. And as I mentioned toward the end, and Fonz points it out in his book, that Neil could have done more. He could have rushed those Confederates away from his front and still done what he did. But he didn't go and ask permission. He didn't want to violate any orders, and he didn't ask permission. So he became a major general after the Civil War. He might have made the right decision. Open to more questions. I know, Charlie, you won't ask any questions because it's not the Navy. I know. Okay, well, if that's it, we're going to put Stuart back on the line.
Yeah. Well, son.
You gotta shut it all down. You gotta shut it.
Okay.
No, just shut this mute. Yours. There you go.
Yeah.
Ooh, echoey.
Sounds like General Neal would have made a great state employee. So, well, thank you everyone for attending, and I also want to thank you, Mark, and also thank Bus Secretary Pat O'Connor. If it wasn't for his technical skill, we never would have been able to put this on. As we mentioned before, if you missed any part of the presentation, or if you want to see it again, it will be posted on YouTube. Look for an email from Pat O'Connor with a link. Now, of course, normally we would be presenting our speaker with a framed certificate, but I think that's going to have to wait until the next time we get together in a real location, which we hope will be very soon. Our next meeting is scheduled for September, but whether that will be another virtual presentation or whether we'll be meeting at Swifties or perhaps another venue is going to depend upon how the situation looks at that point in time. Watch your emails, and hopefully we'll be able to fill you in more at a later date. Once again, thanks. Good night, everybody, and stay healthy.
Good night.
Good night, everybody.
Yep. Good night, everyone.
Thanks a lot, appreciate it.
Wonderful meeting.
Here. Okay. Good night.
Good night.
Good night.
Night. Thank you.
Good night, John.
Good night.
How do I get out? Please.
I'm unmuted. They'll probably bounce now.
So I can leave?